When you look at China's nuclear arsenal, over the last few decades, one thing was always missing. They had the land-based missiles sitting in silos or on mobile launchers, the kind of hardware you can parade down Tiananmen Square and remind the world of your reach. They had submarines cruising under the seas, carrying ballistic missiles that could deliver a devastating second strike if anyone dared to hit them first. But there was a hole in that picture, something that kept analysts saying China's deterrence wasn't quite on par with the United States or Russia. That missing piece was an airborne nuclear option, the ability to put a warhead on a bomber, fly it anywhere, and launch it from the sky. For years, Beijing's bomber force was almost a relic, a political symbol more than a strategic weapon. They could carry cruise missiles, yes, but they didn't have the kind of long-range, air-launched ballistic missile that transforms a bomber into something truly dangerous. That's where the JL-1 changes everything, because with its arrival, China can finally say it has a complete nuclear triad. This might sound like a technical detail, but in strategic terms, it's massive. Nuclear triads aren't just about having 3 different platforms for the sake of variety. They're about resilience and unpredictability. If your nuclear weapons only sit in silos, satellites can track them, and enemy missiles can target them in a first strike. If your weapons are only on submarines, then you're betting your survival on how stealthy those submarines really are and how well they can avoid detection. But add bombers to the mix, especially bombers that can fly inland and launch from thousands of kilometers away, and suddenly you've created a new layer of uncertainty. An adversary can't just focus on your land missiles or your submarines anymore. They have to worry about what's in the air, and that makes planning against you much harder. For China, this is more than just matching the United States or Russia in theory. It's about breaking out of the box those powers had tried to keep it in. For decades, the story went that Beijing had a small, limited deterrent, enough to make someone think twice, but not enough to really project unpredictable nuclear power on the same level as the Cold War giants. That narrative starts to fall apart with the JL-1. Now, Chinese bombers can take off from inland bases, vanish from radar coverage, and potentially strike anywhere across the Pacific or beyond. That unpredictability is the core of deterrence, making sure your adversary never feels confident enough to try something rash, because they can't be certain of stopping your retaliation. So when people say China now has its full nuclear triad, they mean it has finally reached the level where no single domain can be neutralized. Land, sea, and air all reinforce each other. If one leg is threatened, the other 2 still hold. If 2 are blocked, the third can still respond. And the arrival of the JL-1 means the air leg, once the weakest, is now a very real threat. It's not about raw numbers of missiles alone. It's about creating a strategic balance where every path of attack is covered and every attempt to disable your arsenal has cracks in it. For Beijing, completing this triad is like hanging a "do not touch" sign over its nuclear forces. It's a statement that China is no longer a junior nuclear power. It is a full-spectrum nuclear state with all the unpredictability and leverage that brings. The breakthrough of the JL-1 really lies in the fact that it isn't just another missile bolted onto an aircraft, it's an air-launched ballistic missile. And that phrase alone changes the entire equation of how strategic weapons work. When a missile is launched from the ground, whether it's sitting in a silo or riding on a mobile launcher, its range is limited to how much fuel it can carry and how fast it can climb out of the atmosphere. A submarine works in a similar way, except it starts from under the ocean. But the JL-1 cheats in a sense because it begins its journey already tens of thousands of feet in the air, dropped from a bomber like the H-20. By launching from altitude, the missile doesn't waste precious energy just climbing. Gravity helps it fall into motion, the engines fire, and suddenly you've stretched the missile's legs far beyond what it could do from the ground. That's why analysts estimate its range in the staggering bracket of 500 to 5,000 kilometers, and some even whisper it could be higher. Think about what that range actually means in practice. If a bomber carrying the JL-1 takes off from central China, it doesn't need to fly all the way to the coastline to strike a target across the Pacific. It can get airborne, climb high, drop the missile, and the missile itself will cover the rest of the distance. From patrol zones in the South China Sea, the JL-1 could threaten Guam. From further inland, depending on trajectory, it could even reach Hawaii or graze the edges of the continental United States. And that's the power of combining an aircraft with a ballistic missile. Suddenly, geography doesn't provide the comfort it once did. Bases thought to be out of reach are now within striking distance. The other thing about being air-launched is flexibility. A silo is stuck where it's built. A submarine has to creep through waters where it can still be hunted. But a bomber can take off from one base today, land at another tomorrow, refuel in the sky, circle in unexpected patterns, and essentially turn into a moving launch pad. That flexibility means the JL-1 isn't tied to predictable routes or fixed positions. For planners trying to anticipate a threat, that makes the job much harder. You can't blanket the sky with missile defenses, and you certainly can't guess where a bomber will be when the launch happens. And let's not forget the psychological side of it. For decades, the U.S. was comfortable knowing it owned the skies when it came to long-range airborne nuclear deterrence. With weapons like the AGM-86 cruise missile, and now the LRSO in development, America assumed it had an advantage in that domain. The JL-1 closes that gap. It doesn't just give China a similar weapon, it gives them a weapon designed to be unpredictable in its use. It means the U.S. can no longer think of bombers as a weak link in China's nuclear strategy. Instead, they're suddenly a wild card, and wild cards are what keep commanders awake at night. The word that keeps coming back when you talk about the JL-1 is unpredictability. That's the real weapon here, not just the explosive yield or the impressive range figures. Land-based missiles are threatening, of course, but they can be tracked. Satellites pick up their locations, analysts know where the silos are, and even mobile launchers, as tricky as they are, tend to leave trails that can be followed with enough surveillance. Submarines are more elusive, but modern sonar networks, underwater drones, and persistent maritime patrols mean that hunters can at least narrow down where those boats might be hiding. None of that applies neatly to an airborne ballistic missile. Once a bomber takes off, it becomes a ghost of sorts. It could be carrying a live weapon or just running a routine training flight. It could be heading east or west, climbing high or dropping low, and no one on the outside really knows until the belly hatch opens and the missile drops. That's the kind of uncertainty that keeps adversaries guessing every single time a radar operator sees a Chinese bomber blip on the screen. And that uncertainty isn't just annoying for military planners, it's destabilizing. Imagine being in charge of missile defenses or regional strategy in the Pacific. You see H-6N bombers leaving bases in Henan. Are they training? Are they testing a new system? Or is tonight the night one of those aircraft releases a JL-1 aimed at Guam or Okinawa? You can't intercept the bomber before you know what it's carrying, and once the missile is in the air, the clock is ticking. That's why unpredictability can sometimes be more frightening than brute force. It turns ordinary flights into potential crises and forces the other side to remain on edge constantly. The genius of the JL-1, if you can call it that, is how it weaponizes this uncertainty. Every bomber sortie becomes a statement. We could launch from here, or here, or here. It's a psychological play as much as a technical one. Unlike a silo you can target with a first strike or a submarine you can try to trail, a bomber with an air-launched ballistic missile introduces too many possibilities. It could take off from deep inland, climb, launch, and return before anyone even knows what happened. It doesn't matter if the bomber itself isn't stealthy or fast. It's the missile it carries that counts. And that missile has the legs to cover distances that were once thought safe. For the United States and its allies, this unpredictability forces a rethink. Their defensive grids are built around known launch patterns, watching for silos, scanning oceans for submarine plumes, tracking cruise missiles as they skim the surface. None of those defenses are perfectly adapted to missiles that simply drop out of the sky. So it's not just about one new weapon entering the mix. It's about adding a layer of doubt that shakes confidence in existing protections. That's what makes the JL-1 such a game changer. It doesn't have to fire every time a bomber takes off. The mere possibility that it could is enough to rewrite strategy across the Pacific. The real headache for the United States and its allies is that their entire defensive posture was built on certain assumptions about how and where missile threats would appear. For decades, radar networks, interceptor batteries, and naval missile defense systems were tuned to look in very specific directions. Satellites scan for the telltale heat plumes of silo launches. Aegis destroyers patrol to watch for submarine-based missiles. Ground radars focus on detecting low, flying cruise missiles that skim the surface. All of these systems are impressive, but they are designed to counter threats that come from the ground or from the sea. What happens when the missile comes from the sky? That's the uncomfortable question the JL-1 forces onto every American commander in the Pacific. The United States has long believed that bombers are the weakest link in a nuclear triad. Too slow, too big, too vulnerable, easy to track, easy to shoot down. Or so the thinking went. That's why U.S. doctrine leans so heavily on stealth bombers and long-range standoff cruise missiles, because they provided survivability and distance. China's H-6N isn't stealthy, and it isn't particularly fast, but when it carries an air-launched ballistic missile, the equation changes. Now the bomber doesn't have to sneak deep into enemy territory. It just has to get high enough to release a weapon that can fly thousands of kilometers on its own. Suddenly, the supposed weakness of the bomber is irrelevant. The JL-1 flips the script, turning the bomber into a wild card instead of a liability. Picture a U.S. carrier strike group somewhere in the Philippine Sea. The admiral in charge knows the threats he's supposed to worry about. He watches for DF-26, carrier killer, ballistic missiles launched from the mainland. He keeps an eye on submarines that might try to pop up and launch JL-3 missiles from the depths. He calculates his defenses with those threats in mind. But then imagine a radar operator spotting a missile arc in from the stratosphere, not from a silo, not from the sea, but from an altitude launch. The JL-1 bypasses the mental map that American defenses are built around. It strikes from above, from angles that interceptors and radars weren't designed to cover, leaving just enough time for chaos, but not enough for certainty. That's what makes this development so dangerous. It's not that the JL-1 is guaranteed to defeat every defense thrown at it. Interceptors might get lucky, radars might adjust, but the very fact that it exists erodes the sense of security U.S. planners once had. Defenses work best when you know what you're defending against. The JL-1 robs you of that certainty. It forces the U.S. to prepare for an attack vector it didn't prioritize, stretching resources thinner, creating gaps elsewhere, and constantly gnawing at confidence. In the world of nuclear deterrence, perception is almost as important as raw capability, and the perception now is that the U.S. can no longer assume the skies are theirs to dominate. China has inserted a new layer of doubt, and doubt is often the sharpest weapon in strategy. What makes the JL-1 even more chilling isn't just what it can do today, but what it could become tomorrow. Right now, it's strapped to the H-6N bomber, an aircraft that is reliable but hardly state-of-the-art. It isn't stealthy, it isn't lightning fast, and against a peer adversary it would likely be detected long before it reached a launch point. But the missile it carries more than compensates for those weaknesses, and that's before you factor in what's coming next. China is developing the H-20, its first true stealth bomber, designed to rival the American B-2 and B-21 in terms of invisibility and survivability. Now imagine the JL-1 not on an aging H-6, but on a radar-evading, long-range stealth platform that can slip deep into contested airspace and launch without ever being seen. That combination is a nightmare for any defense planner. A missile that already stretches ranges into the thousands of kilometers, paired with a bomber you can't track until it's too late, creates a strike capability that borders on unstoppable. And the truth is, the JL-1 was never meant to be the end of the story. It's a stepping stone, proof that China can take a concept once thought out of reach and bring it into reality. The specs already hint at future evolutions, larger payloads, maneuverable reentry vehicles, even multiple warheads. If those upgrades appear in tandem with a stealth bomber, the balance of power shifts dramatically. It wouldn't just close the gap with the United States in the air-launched deterrence domain. It could tilt it. For the first time, Washington would have to worry not only about Chinese land and sea missiles, but about a fleet of bombers capable of launching nuclear strikes from anywhere, at any time, without warning. That's why the JL-1 is more than just a new missile. It's a signal of intent. It shows that Beijing doesn't just want parity, it wants options, flexibility, leverage. And in nuclear strategy, having options is everything. Because the more ways you can deliver a strike, the more difficult it is for an adversary to stop you, and the less likely they are to risk testing you. The JL-1 makes every Chinese bomber flight a question mark, and when the H-20 enters the skies, that question mark could turn into an exclamation point. So if you step back and look at the bigger picture, the arrival of the JL-1 isn't just about numbers or ranges. It's about psychology. It plants doubt in the minds of rivals, reshapes the mental map of deterrence, and sets the stage for an even more dangerous next generation of weapons. And that's exactly why this story matters. It's about the shift from old assumptions to a new reality, one where China's bombers can no longer be dismissed as relics. They're now part of a full spectrum nuclear force that the world has to take seriously. If you've made it this far, you know how fast the balance of power in the skies is changing. And this is only the beginning. To keep up with the weapons, the strategies, and the breakthroughs shaping tomorrow's wars, make sure you hit that subscribe button, stay tuned, and join us as we keep pulling back the curtain on the race for dominance.